Hello everybody and welcome to my second recap video for everything Total War 3 Kingdoms. If you haven't checked it out already, I recommend watching my first video recapping the first 9 months of marketing material for the game, broken down into the 7 major gameplay features that were revealed up to that point. Now it's been a few months since I did that video and we have a bit more information to go through, most notably the 2-part diplomacy video, which showcased the campaign being played for the first time, as well as a few new characters and trailers to go through as well. Also, I'm going to be looking at some of the more minor features that we can see in the video from different UI elements such as population, food, buildings, supply, and a few other little mechanics. Alright, let's get started with the biggest stuff first. Also, word of warning, I'll be pronouncing things wrong as per usual. Okay, so first up are the new diplomacy mechanics. There are now 4 major categories within which you can conduct diplomacy. There's war and peace, trade and marriage, alliances, and diplomatic treaties. Within War and Peace, there's now around 13 options to choose from, depending on your given situation. Now, I've broken these up depending on that situation. They're kind of sprawled all over the list, and I've just kind of categorized them, depending on your situation. So, the first ones are the options you can do by default, just so you can kind of do them whenever. You can issue ultimatum. So this means that if you have a deal, and you issue an ultimatum, that if they don't accept the deal, war between you is automatically declared. It's sort of like the accept or we will attack from the older Total War games, but in this case, you're forced to commit to the attack rather than just use it as a diplomatic buff. Then we have declare war and request peace. This is your standard way of getting peace and war. Then we have request military support. This is basically join war, so if you're at war, you can ask someone to join it. And lastly, in this category, we have support independence. We don't really have the exact details on this, but I'm guessing you'll join a vassal in an uprising against their master. Now the next category is kind of if you're in an alliance. You can request allied support, so this means asking your allies to declare war on this faction that you're already in a solo war with. Then you have declare an alliance war, so this is when you propose a vote to your alliance to start a war. And then we have negotiate peace. This is to propose a vote to your alliance to end the war that you're all in. Next is then if you have a vassal, so you can call this vassal to arms, which is to ask this vassal to join you in a war, or you can call all of your vassals to arms, which is, I guess, just to call all your vassals to war against a particular faction. And lastly is a category for if you are a vassal. You can declare independence, so break away from your master. You can request permission to declare war. This one's pretty interesting. It means that if you are a vassal, you can request permission that your master declares war on another faction and you'll join them. So I guess you don't really have the autonomy as a vassal to kind of declare your own wars. You have to ask your overlord to do the war for you and you'll just join them. Then you can aid master in one of their wars. So this is offer aid to your master in one of their wars should you not already be involved. So I guess there can also be situations where your overlord goes to war with someone else and doesn't ask you to be part of it, and then you can offer aid to them if you wish. So that's just the war and peace category. A lot of it is obviously very circumstantial, but it's great to see so many dynamic options that can be used in a series of situations. You can fight to support vassals, vote with allies to declare wars, call your vassals to arms, and even threaten to declare war if it's all refused. Now of course, with all of these options, the diplomacy will only ever be as good as its AI, but these features have been long requested and no game has ever had them until now, so I would assume, giving them the benefit of the doubt, that they've worked on the AI with these options in mind, so hopefully it will still create a really interesting web of alliances, vassals, and betrayals. The next category is trade and marriage. Now the main takeaway here is that you now have more things to trade. You can buy and sell food, you can request and make payments, trade ancillaries for characters, create trade agreements, and even trade territories. Now this is a much needed feature in the Total War games that use the province system. Regions would often depend on the province, and sharing them with an ally was a huge pain, especially if your culture is kind of conflicted. You couldn't just give your ally a town, so you were often forced to go to war. This game doesn't appear to have culture or maybe even a traditional province system, so it seems much less needed here, but nevertheless, it's still a great addition to see it come back, as you can now conquer territories for your allies if you wished, or maybe even buy your way to victory. Now you can only trade territory if the faction borders you, and you can't trade near your faction capital, so there are some limitations there, which generally is a good thing. You don't want to be completely steamrolling the map by just bribing diplomacy. Now as well as that, with the other new trade options, you can amass a food empire potentially, and use that as a bartering chip to gain more money or to starve out competition. It should be fun to see if the AI really do rely on food as much as the player does, as that will give you way more options when it comes to diplomacy. Now the last thing was to arrange marriages, but we don't know anything really about it yet, so we'll just have to wait to see further details. The next category is alliances. The first new addition is a form of alliance called a coalition. Now this is a sort of soft alliance where you improve relations over time, share your visibility and supply in each other's lands, and you can vote to attack people together, but you can still declare your own wars and fight solo without dragging other members in if you wish. If you're in kind of a solo war, you can also then just ask members individually or ask them all to kind of come in and help. Now any member of a coalition can invite another one to join, but it has to be voted on to accept that member, and if you don't like a member, you can all vote to kick them. Next is a military alliance. You can form one of these outright by asking someone to form one with you, or you can upgrade a coalition to a military alliance if you put it to a vote. However, if the vote passes with the majority, those that opposed it will be cast out of that alliance. Now the main difference with a military alliance to a coalition is that if you're in a defensive war, you can call your allies to help and they are forced to do it. It's like a strong obligation to do it. Now interestingly, when ending an alliance war, it's put to a majority vote, but again, if the vote passes, the opposing members will be kicked out and continue the fight on their own. Now personally, I see that as a bit of an issue. Just because someone didn't win the vote doesn't mean they should necessarily be turfed out of the alliance in my opinion. They can still just leave, or you could just kick them if they're unhappy, but if they disagree once despite being a loyal ally, they might end up being on their own, and even being killed if they're just left in a war. We'll have to see how that works out, and things can still be subject to change. The very last section is diplomatic treaties. Now diplomatic treaties weren't really shown in great detail in the video, but what we did see is the option to get non-aggression pacts, vassalize someone or offer yourself as a vassal, demand or offer a guarantee of autonomy, request liberation from your master, confederate with someone, liberate, integrate or annex, and then abdicate emperorship. So it raises a lot of questions, but it's quite interesting to see the peaceful ways in which you can grow by annexing a vassal or by confederating with a potential ally. We'll have to wait and see how the emperorship plays a role, as it seems to be some sort of endgame mechanic with people staking a claim to it. And that's everything we know so far about diplomacy. It's a seemingly very deep and dynamic overhaul to diplomacy that not only adds in old features, but adds an even greater amount of new ones, such as trading food, granting autonomy, voting-based alliances, and more. It's very exciting stuff for the franchise. I mean, even for those who aren't sold on the period or the art style of this game, the chances are that this will continue its way into the next Total War games and beyond. So it's a big thumbs up for the dedication to diplomacy, as it's been long requested. Next, I want to go through some of the lesser talked about features that made appearances in the recent videos we saw. First, we have military supplies. Military supplies was briefly touched on to describe the fact that when you're in allied territory, you may gain supply, but in hostile territory, you lose supply. It seems like seasonal effects, climate, characters, and potentially other factors affect an army's supply. If supply is low, you may suffer attrition and negative morale in battle, and on the flip side, good supply promotes high replenishment and high morale. This is a pretty nice system, and it seems to work very similar to the Thrones of Britannia supply system. It lacks the complexity of something like Divide et Impera system, where distance from supply depots is factored in, and you can forage for food based on fertility, but I still think it works really well at its overall goal of stopping armies pushing too deep into enemy territory. It also seems a lot more severe than that in Thrones. I mean, as based on one tooltip, it seems like you'll only be able to sustain yourself in enemy territory for a handful of turns before you'll really start suffering from attrition. Now, it is all placeholder numbers at this point, but it's still interesting to see that it's definitely way more harsh. Next is population. In a few tooltips, we can see that settlements, now called commanderies, have a population number. The higher the population in a given area, the higher the peasantry income and the army replenishment. It also sees a reduction in construction costs and construction times, which is very interesting. So this means maybe along the lines of like a large city with a low population will take a long time to build something and it'll be more expensive, whereas a booming smaller town can catch up quicker. I think that's a very good idea. Now, growth of population is affected by public order, infrastructure or buildings, and surplus food. While population is a much requested feature, it doesn't seem like this ties to the military in any meaningful way. Now, in the older games and in mods, sacking or exterminating a city will leave it hurting for both income and the ability to recruit new armies there. Now, the numbers were never really historical. Towns often just had 2,000 people in them, but it made you care about the armies that you had. Losing 2,000 men in a battle and then draining a town, it was a very important concept to the older games. However, in this game, the examples that we see at least, cities have over 700,000 people in them and grow by 16,000 per turn potentially. Now, that's more than you'll ever need to create an army. Most Total War armies are around 3,000 men typically. But we don't know the full extent. Perhaps low city population prevents recruitment, which would achieve the same effect, and it would also give you more plausible numbers historically in a city. We don't know enough about it yet, but I strongly feel that for population to matter, especially the way the community kind of wants it to or remembers it did, it has to tie to armies more directly, more than just replenishment. The next mechanic is food. Nothing too crazy here, but essentially food is produced and consumed at the same time each turn. It's never really stored. So surplus food, as we saw, helps with supplies, replenishment, and growth of settlements, and presumably the opposite is true if you have low food. Now you can trade for food, which is also interesting, so there's more ways to sustain yourself. Now presumably, seasons probably affect it, as it did in a game like Shogun 2, and for those interested, the game seems to move at 4 turns per year, as next season is referenced in a bunch of tooltips as kind of what it means to be the next turn. The next mechanic is faction rank. Now this is similar to Imperium from other recent Total War games. In Three Kingdoms, this is now kind of called faction prestige. You can increase your prestige by building special buildings, which in and of itself is quite interesting. It's kind of like an economic way to do it, or by expanding and taking settlements in a traditional way. Now as you do this, you move up this chain and you're granted more ability to have more armies, have more diplomatic options, and even have more trade partners. Basically just scale up. Now keen-eyed viewers out there will notice the use of the word extra spy positions and extra assignments. From a PC Games N article, game director Janusz Gasper discussed how spies are changing in Three Kingdoms. Spies are no longer agents on the map that roam around, but instead are recruited from your own characters. So a character that you already have may just become a spy, and then they can go to another faction, and as they rank up there, they can even become influential generals or governors, and you can possibly steal armies or cities from the enemy. These agent actions cost a lot, and they're always going to succeed, but the risk comes from the chance of being discovered. No word yet on really how you root out other enemy spies, and no gameplay yet attached to this, but it's just certainly an interesting concept I look forward to seeing more of. I will miss the ability of agents and spies actually uncovering the map and being physical things that move around, but it sounds like a kind of a deep replacement for it anyway. Next is just a very quick look at the building screen. Now we can't decipher too much from here with any certainty, but from looking at an empty slot, it seems like there's 15 building chains split into the 5 Wuxing categories. Now this also doesn't take into account main cities or ports, and then there also seems to be resource-based buildings that are preset and cannot change, such as farms. And these can actually be occupied individually. This is very similar to the Thrones of Britannia system for these kind of outcrop buildings. However, it's hard to say for sure how this is going to work, so we'll just have to leave it there. The last feature is the character overview screen. Here we can see that different characters can recruit their own special units, and they seem to have 3 dominant, maybe perhaps preset traits, and then multiple smaller traits that can change after that. These traits seem to then have opposing traits, like decisive opposes indecisive. They also have things they value, like a scholar values education, and we can see school buildings were grouped in the same color category as that too. Someone clever admires intelligence, and this seems to feed into the fact that they also have relations with other characters. So the character stuff really does seem very in-depth, and assuming there's some sort of family tree to help keep track of it, it should be interesting to see how these stories unfold between characters. Now on top of all that, mentioned at the beginning of the video for part 1 diplomacy, we learned that characters affect their faction traits somewhat. Now, different leaders and different heirs will affect what your faction buffs are, but not all of your buffs, just some of them. Some of them will be preset, faction traits to kind of encourage diversity amongst the factions, but then other ones will be also largely determined by your faction leaders. So leaders will definitely have a greater impact on your faction at large. Alright, so that's it for everything Three Kingdoms lately. Now there's also been some character posters, there's been some trailers, but I prefer to focus on the actual kind of concrete details like the gameplay, the mechanics, and actually seeing how it actually plays in videos if possible, especially when we're only actually around 3 months from the game coming out now. Now I try to keep my opinion out largely where I can, but I do get asked my thoughts on it, and basically I really like the sound of almost every addition that we've talked about here. The mechanics sound great, a lot of it is just on paper for now. We'll have to see how it really plays, like I said, with the AI and diplomacy, but giving them the benefit of the doubt, perhaps it sounds like really great stuff. Now unfortunately, I'm still just not a big fan of the aesthetic. That's the kind of thing that I just can't really get over. I like grounded and kind of more realistic looking games. This is very arcadey in its presentation and its UI and its retelling of history. Obviously it's using the romance rather than real history, I guess, and that stuff is it just puts me off. It's a really big hurdle for me to get over. However, it will be interesting to see how classic mode fares and what mods can do with that. And you know, I'm sure that modders, depending on the mod tools that's available, will be able to ground it down even further. So it'd be interesting to see how that all plays out. Either way, more mechanics and stuff like the features that we've mentioned today in this video, they do keep pulling me back in and making me go, oh yeah, actually, you know, despite me not really caring about any of these characters, I'm actually quite interested to see how this will play. And it's definitely a step in the right direction for the franchise as well. Alright, so that is going to be it for the video. Remember to leave a like if you want to see more Total War 3 Kingdoms stuff on the channel as we lead up to release, and perhaps even beyond release in the form of guides and things like that. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.